The first thing Nell Vance noticed was the faint metallic tang of old blood, long since dried not through her nose, but as a prickle at the back of her throat, a phantom sensation clinging to the air around the great stone fireplace in the east parlor. It was a smell that seemed to escape everyone else, a secret whisper born on the perpetual, inexplicable draft that slipped from behind the hearth, even in the height of summer. She had always dismissed it as the peculiar scent of old stone and forgotten soot, a quirk of the grand, imposing structure that dominated the room. But on that particular autumn evening in 1847, as the gaslights flickered and cast dancing shadows across the ornate mantel, Nell felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the chill. It was the distinct, unsettling feeling that the fireplace was not merely a part of the house, but a silent, watchful entity, a guardian of something profoundly unsettling, something that promised to unravel the very fabric of Harwick Falls. Before we continue with the story of Harwick Falls, I have a small request for you. If you're enjoying this journey into the past and the mysteries it holds, please take a moment to subscribe to Canal Ingle. Your support helps us bring more captivating stories like this one to life. And while you're at it, drop a comment below and let us know what state or city you're listening from. We love to hear where our stories travel. Harwick Falls, nestled in the verdant embrace of western Massachusetts, was in the year 1847 a town carved from ambition and industry. The Harwick River, a tireless artery, cut through the landscape. Its ceaseless flow was harnessed by the colossal water-powered textile mill. The mill was the town's beating heart, its rhythmic thrum a constant backdrop to daily life, a sound that permeated the very soil and air. From dawn until dusk, the mill's towering brick edifice exhaled plumes of steam, a testament to progress and prosperity. The main street, a dusty ribbon winding alongside the river, was lined with sturdy clapboard buildings: the general store, the blacksmith, the modest church with its white steeple piercing the sky, and a handful of homes belonging to the town's more affluent citizens. Beyond these rows of smaller, identical cottages housed the mill workers, their lives inextricably linked to the mill's relentless schedule. At the apex of this meticulously structured world stood Edmund Vance, the mill owner. At 41, Edmund was a figure of imposing stature and impeccable reputation. His broad shoulders, always clad in finely tailored wool, seemed to bear the weight of the entire town's economy. His voice, deep and resonant, commanded respect in town meetings, and his philanthropic gestures, a new bell for the church, a donation to the schoolhouse, were always met with effusive praise. He was the embodiment of the era's post-war prosperity, a man who had built his fortune on the back of manifest destiny's relentless optimism, weaving cotton into wealth. Yet beneath the polished veneer of civic leadership, there was a certain guardedness in Edmund's eyes, a subtle tension in his jawline that Nell, his wife of 2 years, had come to recognize but never quite understand. Nell, at 34, was a woman of quiet strength and keen observation. Her marriage to Edmund outwardly was a picture of domestic bliss. Their union had been celebrated with much fanfare, a joining of 2 prominent families, though Nell had brought little in the way of material wealth, only her sharp intellect and a gentle, unassuming beauty. She managed the grand Vance house with effortless grace, overseeing the small staff, hosting Edmund's business associates, and maintaining the delicate social balance expected of a mill owner's wife. Yet the house, for all its grandeur, often felt cold, a gilded cage. Edmund, though outwardly affectionate, maintained a certain emotional distance, a wall that Nell found impenetrable. Their conversations often revolved around mill business, town affairs, or the weather, rarely delving into the deeper currents of their shared lives. Her closest confidant was Clara Dyer, the town's schoolteacher. Clara, 31, was a woman of vibrant intellect and insatiable curiosity, her spectacles often perched on the end of her nose as she devoured books and newspapers. Their friendship was a lifeline for Nell, a space where she could shed the expectations of her station and simply be herself. They would often meet for tea, discussing everything from the latest fashions to the burgeoning women's rights movement, their laughter echoing through the quiet parlors. The Vance house itself was a monument to old money and new ambition. A sprawling federal-style mansion, it sat atop a gentle rise overlooking the town, its white clapboard facade gleaming in the sun, its dark green shutters providing a stark contrast. Inside, polished mahogany gleamed, heavy velvet drapes softened the light, and intricate Persian rugs muffled footsteps. The air was often thick with the scent of beeswax polish, dried lavender, and the faint, ever-present aroma of pipe tobacco from Edmund's study. But it was the east parlour that held a particular, almost magnetic draw for Nell. This room, rarely used for formal entertaining, was dominated by a colossal stone fireplace, a masterpiece of local masonry. Its rough-hewn granite blocks rose almost to the ceiling, a formidable presence that seemed to absorb all light and sound. Edmund had an unspoken rule about the east parlour: no one was to move the furniture near the fireplace, nor was it to be redecorated. He simply stated it was perfect as it was, a pronouncement that brooked no argument. Nell often felt a peculiar chill emanating from its depths, a cold draught that defied the warmth of the roaring fires they occasionally lit. It was a draught that seemed to carry with it that faint, inexplicable scent, a whisper of something ancient and unsettling. In 1848, a young woman named Abigail Pratt had briefly worked in the Vance household. Abigail, barely 17, was a quiet, diligent girl from one of the mill worker families, her hands quick and her eyes observant. She had been hired to assist with the heavier cleaning tasks, a temporary position that lasted only a few months. Then, one crisp October morning, Edmund announced that Abigail had left for Boston to seek better opportunities. He had even provided her mother, Dorothea Pratt, with an address where Abigail supposedly resided. Dorothea, a woman already stooped by hardship, had clung to this news, sending letters filled with news from Harwick Falls, hopes for her daughter's success, and pleas for a return visit. But no reply ever came, not a single letter. The silence was a heavy shroud over the Pratt cottage, a silence that Nell, in her own quiet way, had begun to notice. The town, accustomed to the transient nature of mill workers, had quickly forgotten Abigail, but Dorothea Pratt never did, and Nell, though she couldn't articulate why, felt a prickle of unease whenever Abigail's name, or rather her absence, was mentioned. The east parlour, the cold draught, the faint smell, and the missing girl. These threads, disparate as they seemed, were beginning to weave a pattern in Nell's mind, a pattern she was not yet ready to acknowledge. The smell of the mill was a complex symphony: the sharp, oily tang of machinery, the sweet, earthy scent of raw cotton, the acrid bite of dyes, and the pervasive dampness of the river. It clung to Edmund's clothes when he returned home, a scent of industry and power. The sound of the water wheel, a constant groaning churn, was the town's heartbeat, a reminder of the relentless march of time and labor. Nell often found herself staring at the east parlor fireplace, tracing the rough texture of its granite blocks, feeling the inexplicable cold that seemed to radiate from its core. She would run her fingers over the intricate carvings on the mantelpiece, a small, almost imperceptible detail that seemed out of place with the otherwise rustic stone. It was a detail that suggested a deliberate artistry, a careful construction rather than an organic part of the house's original design. The wallpaper in the parlor, a rich damask pattern in deep crimson, felt strangely heavy, as if it were trying to absorb the very light from the room, leaving the corners in perpetual shadow. Nell often wondered if the house itself held secrets, if the very walls could speak of what they had witnessed. Her marriage, like the town, was outwardly prosperous, a testament to order and decorum. But beneath the surface, a quiet disquiet was beginning to stir, a premonition that the carefully constructed facade of Harwick Falls, and indeed of her own life, was far more fragile than it appeared. The year was 1851, and the subtle cracks in Nell's carefully constructed world were beginning to widen. The faint metallic smell that she had first noticed years ago, a scent she had tried to rationalize as the residue of old fires, now seemed to intensify on particularly cold nights, especially when the wind howled down the chimney. It wasn't the comforting aroma of wood smoke, nor the musty odor of damp stone. It was something sharper, more acrid, a scent that hinted at decay yet was not quite rot. It was a smell that made the hairs on her arms prickle, a smell that seemed to emanate directly from the heart of the great stone fireplace in the east parlor. She would often find herself drawn to the room after Edmund had retired, pressing her palm against the cold granite, trying to discern the source of the persistent chill, the origin of that unsettling aroma. One crisp autumn morning, as she supervised the housemaid dusting the parlor, Nell noticed something she had never seen before. On the polished oak floorboards directly in front of the fireplace, partially obscured by the heavy Persian rug, were a series of faint semicircular scratches. They formed an arc, as if a heavy, unyielding object had been dragged across the floor repeatedly in a precise sweeping motion. The marks were old, almost worn smooth, but unmistakable. They suggested that the entire stone structure of the fireplace, or at least a significant portion of it, had been moved, perhaps even pivoted on numerous occasions. A cold dread, sharp and sudden, pierced through Nell. Why would anyone move such a massive, permanent fixture? And what could possibly be behind it that required such an effort? Later that week, Nell, attempting to broach the subject delicately, mentioned to Edmund her desire to redecorate the east parlor. "Perhaps a lighter wallpaper, Edmund, and we could rearrange the furniture to make the room feel less imposing," she suggested, gesturing vaguely toward the fireplace. Edmund, who was usually amenable to her domestic suggestions, reacted with a startling, almost violent anger. His face, usually so composed, flushed a deep crimson, and his eyes, normally calm, narrowed to slits. "The east parlor is perfectly adequate as it is, Nell," he snapped, his voice tight with an unfamiliar fury. "I will not have you meddling with it. Some things are best left untouched." The vehemence of his response, so disproportionate to her innocent suggestion, silenced Nell immediately. But it also ignited a spark of suspicion within her, a tiny ember of doubt that would soon grow into an inferno. His reaction was not merely a preference for decor, it was a fierce, almost desperate defense of the fireplace itself. Clara, during one of her weekly visits for tea, also noticed the peculiar draft. It was a blustery November afternoon, and despite a small fire crackling merrily in the drawing-room fireplace, a distinct chill permeated the east parlor, where they often retreated for more private conversation. "My goodness, Nell," Clara remarked, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "It feels as though a window has been left ajar in here. Or perhaps your grand fireplace is simply too grand to keep out the cold." She chuckled, attempting to lighten the mood, but Nell did not join her. Instead, she simply stared at the fireplace, a thoughtful, troubled expression on her face. The cold, she knew, was not from an open window, it was from within the wall. The first tangible piece of information, a whisper from the undercurrents of Harwick Falls, came from an unexpected source. Thomas Aldrich, a young mill worker, barely 28, with a quiet demeanor and intelligent eyes, approached Nell one afternoon as she was leaving the general store. He spoke in hushed tones, his gaze darting nervously around. "Mrs. Vance," he began, his voice barely audible. "I feel I must tell you something. It's about Mr. Vance." Nell's heart quickened. "Yes, Thomas," she prompted gently. Late one night in October of '48, he continued, his eyes fixed on a point beyond her shoulder. "I was working the night shift at the mill. I saw Mr. Vance and Mr. Corbett. They were carrying something heavy, into the house through the side entrance near the east wing. It was very late, and they looked strained, like they were trying not to be seen." He paused, then added, "It was the same month Abigail Pratt supposedly left for Boston." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implication. Thomas quickly excused himself, disappearing into the throng of mill workers, leaving Nell with a chilling new piece of the puzzle. October 1848. The same month Abigail vanished. The same month Edmund and Hiram Corbett were seen carrying something heavy into the house near the east wing where the fireplace stood. The following week, driven by a growing sense of dread, Nell decided to visit Dorothea Pratt. The small cottage, smelling faintly of wood smoke and poverty, was a stark contrast to the Vance mansion. Dorothea, her face etched with years of worry, greeted Nell with a mixture of surprise and deference. After a polite exchange about the weather and the price of flour, Nell gently steered the conversation toward Abigail. "Mrs. Pratt," Nell began, her voice soft, I was wondering, have you heard from Abigail recently? It has been some time. Dorothea's eyes, already clouded with sorrow, welled up. No, Mrs. Vance, she whispered, her voice cracking. Not a word. Not a single word since she left. She then shuffled to a small, worn wooden chest in the corner of the room. From it she produced a small battered tin box. Inside, neatly stacked, were dozens of letters, their envelopes yellowed and brittle, each one addressed in Dorothea's careful hand to Miss Abigail Pratt, care of Mrs. Eleanor Finch, 14, Elm Street, Boston. And on each envelope, stamped in stark red ink, were the words "Return to sender, address unknown." Dorothea's voice was barely a whisper. Every letter, Mrs. Vance, every single one. Returned. I sent them for years. I don't understand. Edmund said she was there. He gave me the address himself. Nell stared at the stack of returned letters, a cold knot tightening in her stomach. Edmund had lied. Or at the very least, he had provided a false address. Abigail Pratt had not simply left for Boston. She had vanished. And Edmund Vance was at the center of her disappearance. That night, unable to sleep, Nell found herself at her writing desk, a quill in hand, a blank journal open before her. The gas light cast a soft glow on the page, but her mind was plunged into shadow. The pieces were beginning to coalesce, the inexplicable draft, the metallic smell, the scratches on the floor, Edmund's furious reaction, Thomas Aldrich's hushed confession, and now Dorothea Pratt's returned letters. The weight of this nascent suspicion was almost unbearable. She dipped her quill into the inkwell, her hand trembling slightly, and began to write. Her first entry, a stark declaration of her dawning terror. October 27th, 1851. The air in this house, once so comforting, now feels heavy, thick with unspoken things. I have tried to dismiss the peculiar cold that emanates from the east parlor fireplace, the faint, unsettling scent that clings to its stones. I have tried to ignore the strange marks on the floor, the way the light catches them just so, revealing their arc. But tonight, after seeing Mrs. Pratt's returned letters, after hearing Thomas Aldrich's quiet confession, I can no longer pretend. Edmund's anger, his insistence that the east parlor remain untouched, it all points to something far more sinister than a mere preference for decor. I do not know what is behind that wall, but I know my husband does, and I fear, with a cold dread that chills me to the bone, that it is connected to Abigail Pratt. The thought is monstrous, unspeakable. Yet it persists, a relentless whisper in the quiet corners of my mind. I must know. I must. The journal became her silent confidant, a repository for her burgeoning fears and her meticulous observations. She began to view her husband, her home, and her entire life in Harwick Falls through a new, terrifying lens. The outwardly perfect facade of her marriage now seemed brittle, ready to shatter at the slightest touch. She loved aspects of her life, the comfort, the respect, the quiet companionship of Clara, but the questions forming in her mind, dark and insistent, were like a relentless tide, threatening to sweep away everything she held dear. She feared losing her position, her home, her very identity as Mrs. Vance. But a deeper, more primal fear was taking root, the fear of what she might find if she stopped asking questions. The fear of living a lie, of being complicit in a silence that felt increasingly like a grave. The shadows in the Vance house were growing longer, and Nell knew with a chilling certainty that they were not merely cast by the setting sun. If this story already has you wondering what was really happening behind those walls of the Vance house, you're not alone. Drop a comment below with your theory so far. What do you think Edmund was hiding? And if you haven't already, hit that like button. It means the world to us and helps this story reach more people who love dark history. The years that followed, from 1852 to 1855, were a slow, agonizing descent into a labyrinth of suspicion for Nell. Her initial dread solidified into a grim determination. She moved with a quiet purpose, her outward demeanor unchanged, but her inner world a maelstrom of investigation. She began to cultivate new alliances, seeking knowledge in the most unexpected places. Her first target was Reverend Gideon Holt. The Reverend, a man of 58 with a kindly, scholarly air, was the keeper of Harwick Falls' spiritual and historical records. His study, a dusty sanctuary behind the church, was filled with ancient ledgers, brittle deeds, and meticulously kept baptismal records. Nell, feigning an interest in the town's founding families for a supposed genealogical project, began to spend hours with him. Reverend Holt, flattered by her attention, was an unwitting fountain of information. He showed her the town's original property deeds, tracing the lineage of land ownership back to the colonial era. It was during one of these sessions, poring over a faded map of the Vance estate, that Nell made a crucial discovery. Among the records of Edmund's various land acquisitions and improvements, Reverend Holt produced a deed of purchase from 1847, a year before Abigail's disappearance. It detailed a structural modification to the east wing of the Vance house. The contractor listed was a man named Peter Goff. The deed specified the construction of a new, substantial stone hearth and chimney flue. Reverend Holt recalled the man vaguely. Goff, he mused, tapping a finger on the document. Yes, a skilled mason, came through Harwick Falls for that job, then moved on. Never heard from him again after that. Nell's heart pounded. 1847, the year Edmund married her, the year the great stone fireplace was built. It was not original to the house. It was an addition, a deliberate construction. Armed with this new information, Nell confided in Clara. Her friend, initially skeptical, grew increasingly alarmed as Nell laid out her meticulous findings: the draft, the smell, the scratches, Edmund's anger, Thomas Aldrich's sighting, Dorothea's letters, and now the fireplace's true age. Clara, with her sharp, logical mind, immediately understood the implications. Together they began to search the county land records, a far more arduous task than Nell's gentle inquiries with Reverend Holt. They spent weeks poring over dusty maps and legal documents in the county seat, their fingers stained with ink and age. And there it was, in the original architectural plans of the Vance house, dated 1810. The east wall of the house, where the fireplace now stood, had once featured a small exterior door leading to what was then a modest storage cellar. That door, according to the 1847 modification plans, had been bricked over, and the fireplace constructed directly in front of it. The realization hit Nell with the force of a physical blow. The fireplace was not just built over something, it was built over a door. A door that led to a cellar. A cellar that could be sealed. The growing web of suspicion tightened further in the spring of 1853. Thomas Aldrich, the mill worker who had bravely shared his observation with Nell, quietly disappeared from Harwick Falls. Deputy Wallace Orne, a man of 45 whose loyalty to Edmund Vance was well known, filed a perfunctory report. Thomas Aldrich left of his own accord, seeking employment elsewhere. But Thomas's mother, a frail woman with eyes as haunted as Dorothea Pratt's, sought Nell out. He would never leave without saying goodbye, Mrs. Vance, she sobbed, clutching Nell's hand. He was a good son. He always wrote. He wouldn't just vanish. Nell knew. She knew Thomas hadn't left of his own accord. He had known too much. He had seen too much. And now he too was gone, swallowed by the same silence that had claimed Abigail. Desperate for any shred of hope, Nell decided to take a bold step. She wrote to Boston herself, not to the address Edmund had given Dorothea, but to the city registry office, a formal inquiry. She asked if any record existed of an Abigail Pratt residing in the city since 1849, providing a detailed description of the young woman. 3 agonizing months later, a reply arrived. The official seal of the Boston City Registry Office was cold and impersonal. The letter was brief, concise, and devastating. No record found of an Abigail Pratt matching the description provided residing within the city limits of Boston at any time between 1849 and the present date. Abigail Pratt, it confirmed, had never reached Boston. Meanwhile, the strain of whatever secret he shared with Edmund began to show on Hiram Corbett. Edmund's business partner, a man usually as stoic and unyielding as Edmund himself, began to drink heavily. His once sharp eyes became bloodshot, his hands trembled, and his usually impeccable attire grew disheveled. His wife, Agnes, a nervous, gossipy woman, confided in Clara one afternoon, her voice hushed with fear. "Hiram is not himself. He mutters in his sleep. He says, some things are better left sealed." Over and over again. "Clara, what do you think he means?" Clara, her face pale, simply shook her head. But the words resonated with Nell when Clara relayed them. Some things are better left sealed. The phrase echoed the very act of building a fireplace over a door. Nell's investigation grew bolder, more desperate. She knew Edmund kept a locked desk in his study, a heavy mahogany piece where he stored important documents. One evening, after Edmund had fallen into a deep, alcohol-induced sleep, Nell, her heart hammering against her ribs, found herself standing before the desk. She had learned, through careful observation, that a particular hairpin, one of her own, possessed just the right curve and rigidity to manipulate the desk's simple lock. Her hands, surprisingly steady, worked the mechanism. With a soft click, the drawer sprang open. Inside, among ledgers and correspondence, she found it, a receipt from a Boston ironmonger, dated November 1848. The items listed were chillingly specific: 2 dozen iron bolts, 3 heavy iron hinges, a quantity of quick-setting mortar. The delivery address, Vance Residence, Harwick Falls. November 1848, just weeks after Abigail's disappearance, just weeks after the fireplace was completed. The bolts, the hinges, the mortar, they weren't for a fireplace. They were for a door. An iron door. A door that needed to be sealed, bolted from the outside. The realization was a cold, hard stone in Nell's gut. The fireplace was not just built over a door, it was built to hide a door. A door that could be locked. A door that could imprison. The implications were monstrous, unspeakable. She had been sleeping in this house for 8 years, walking past that fireplace daily, while something or someone may have been sealed behind that wall. The thought was a venomous serpent coiling in her mind, poisoning every corner of her existence. Her journal entries grew more frequent, more frantic, a desperate attempt to record the truth before it consumed her. March 12, 1855. The air is thick with lies. I can taste them, feel them pressing in on me from every wall of this house. The receipt from the ironmonger hidden in Edmund's desk confirms my darkest fears. 2 dozen iron bolts, 3 heavy hinges, quick-setting mortar, these are not the materials for a decorative hearth. These are the instruments of a prison. He built it. He built a wall around a door. And then he built a fireplace over it. And Abigail Pratt vanished the very month it was completed. My mind recoils from the horror. But my heart knows the truth. She was not seeking opportunities in Boston. She was here. She was here, in this house, behind that wall. And Thomas Aldrich, who saw too much, who knew too much, is also gone. The silence of this town is not peace, it is complicity. I walk through these rooms and I feel her presence. A ghost of a girl trapped in the cold stone. I must be careful. Edmund is a dangerous man. But I will not remain silent. Nell's nights became a torment. She would lie awake, listening to the creaks and groans of the old house, each sound amplified in the oppressive silence. She would imagine Abigail trapped, calling out, her voice muffled by stone and mortar. She would rise from her bed, a phantom drawn by an unseen force, and wander through the darkened hallways, her bare feet silent on the polished floors. She would stand before the east parlor fireplace, pressing her ear against the cold, unyielding granite, straining to hear anything beyond the whisper of the draft. Sometimes, in the deepest hours of the night, she thought she heard a faint scratching, a desperate plea, a sound that was not quite human, not quite animal, but something in between, a sound of pure, unadulterated despair. She would tell herself it was the wind, the settling of the house, the fever of her own imagination. But the cold that seeped from the mortar lines, a cold unlike any natural chill, told a different story. It was the cold of a tomb. The psychological toll was immense. Sleeplessness became her constant companion. Her appetite waned, and her reflection in the mirror showed a woman whose eyes held a haunted, desperate light. The terrible knowledge she carried was a heavy burden, a secret that threatened to crush her. She had been sleeping beside a man who was capable of such an atrocity, a man who had built a tomb within his own home. The thought was a constant torment, a betrayal that cut deeper than any physical wound. She feared losing her marriage, her home, her very standing in society. But the alternative, the silence, the complicity, was a fate far worse than any social ruin. She had to know. She had to act. The years between 1856 and 1858 were a crucible for Nell, forging her quiet determination into an unyielding resolve. The pressure mounted, a slow, inexorable squeeze that threatened to shatter her composure. She knew she was walking a perilous path, but the image of Abigail, trapped and forgotten, propelled her forward. Her first direct confrontation with Edmund was a delicate dance, a probing of the edges of his carefully constructed facade. She chose a quiet evening after dinner, when the brandy had mellowed his usual guardedness. "Edmund," she began, her voice carefully neutral, "I was speaking with Dorothea Pratt recently. She still grieves for Abigail. It seems so strange that the girl never wrote home from Boston. Do you ever wonder what became of her?" Edmund's response was immediate, almost too immediate. "Nell, my dear, you know how these young girls are. They go to the city, they find new lives, new loves. They forget their humble beginnings. It is a common enough tale." His voice was smooth, perfectly rehearsed, a well-worn explanation. But Nell watched his eyes. They flickered, just for a fraction of a second, a subtle shift that betrayed a deeper, more complex emotion beneath the placid surface. It was a flicker of something akin to fear, quickly masked by practiced indifference. She filed it away. His answer was too smooth, too perfect. It was the answer of a man who had prepared for this question. A few months later, Judge Elias Finn, a man of 67, a circuit judge and an old friend of Edmund's, visited Harwick Falls. He was a portly man with a booming laugh and a reputation for shrewdness. During a formal dinner, Nell, emboldened by a glass of sherry, casually mentioned her ongoing redecorating plans for the house, specifically the east parlor. "I do believe," she said, addressing the judge with a charming smile, "that the east parlor could benefit from a lighter touch, perhaps a more modern fireplace, something less imposing." She saw it then, a quick, almost imperceptible glance exchanged between Edmund and Judge Finn. A shared look of understanding, a silent communication that spoke volumes. It was a look that confirmed her growing suspicion. Judge Finn was not merely an old friend, he was part of the circle of complicity. The warning came from Deputy Wallace Orne, a man Nell had always considered a benign, if somewhat dull, presence in Harwick Falls. He intercepted her on the main street one afternoon, his usual jovial smile fixed on his face, but his eyes, a cold, flat blue, held a distinct chill. "Mrs. Vance," he began, his voice low and solicitous, "a word of friendly advice, if I may. Harwick Falls is a quiet town. We value our peace. A woman who asks too many questions about her husband's business, especially a woman of your standing, tends to find herself in a very uncomfortable position. For your own good, Mrs. Vance, I suggest you concern yourself with matters more appropriate to your station." The smile never wavered, but the message was clear, a thinly veiled threat. Nell felt a cold dread seep into her bones. It was not just Edmund. It was the town itself, or at least its powerful men, who were invested in this secret. Clara, ever loyal, confirmed Nell's growing fears about the extent of the conspiracy. Edmund, in a move calculated to isolate Nell, approached Clara privately. He invited her to his study, offered her tea, and then, with a paternalistic air, advised her to spend less time with Mrs. Vance for her own good. "Nell has been preoccupied of late. It would be best for her, and for you, to maintain a certain distance." Clara, indignant, immediately relayed the conversation to Nell. "He thinks he can control me, Nell," she exclaimed, her cheeks flushed with anger. He thinks he can dictate my friendships. But for Nell, it was a moment of chilling clarity. It was not one man, it was a circle, a network of powerful men bound by a shared secret, protecting their own. One night, driven by an unbearable urgency, Nell found herself alone in the east parlor. Edmund was away on mill business, a rare absence that offered a window of opportunity. The house was silent, save for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. She approached the fireplace, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She pressed her ear against the cold stones, listening, straining. She heard nothing, only the faint, persistent draft, and that metallic, almost coppery smell, now stronger, more insistent. The cold that seeped through the mortar lines was unlike any cold she had ever felt, an unnatural chill that seemed to penetrate to her very bones. It was the cold of a place where life had been extinguished, a cold that spoke of long-held secrets and forgotten despair. Her hands, guided by a desperate impulse, began to explore the rough surface of the granite. She remembered the scratches on the floor, the implication that the fireplace had been moved. She focused on the base, where the stones met the floorboards. Over the past weeks, she had been slowly, meticulously loosening one particular stone, a large rectangular block at the very bottom near the hearth. She had used a small, sharp chisel, usually reserved for intricate embroidery work, which she kept hidden in her sewing basket. Each night, when the house was silent, she would return, chipping away at the mortar, a tiny, almost imperceptible amount at a time. The work was painstaking, agonizingly slow, but she was driven by a force she could no longer deny. Tonight, the stone felt looser, a subtle give beneath her probing fingers. She worked for hours, the only sound the faint scrape of metal against stone, the only light the flickering flame of a single candle. Dust, fine and grey, coated her hands, her hair, her dress. The air grew heavy with the scent of disturbed mortar and that other, nameless smell. Then, in the spring of 1857, Hiram Corbett died. Officially, the cause was heart failure, a sudden collapse after a particularly strenuous day at the mill. But Agnes Corbett, his widow, a woman now freed from the oppressive silence of her husband, confided in Clara. In his final days, Agnes whispered, her eyes wide with a mixture of grief and terror, Hiram was not himself. He kept saying the same thing over and over, like a broken record. We should have opened it in 49. We should have opened it when there was still time. What did he mean, Clara? What should they have opened? Clara, her face pale, could only offer a comforting hand. But the words opened it in 49 resonated with a terrible clarity for Nell. 1849, the year after Abigail vanished, the year after the fireplace was built. Nell's journal entries, once a record of her observations, now became a desperate outpouring of her soul, a testament to the psychological torment she endured. July 19, 1857. Hiram Corbett is dead, and with him perhaps a piece of the truth. But his dying words, relayed by Agnes through Clara, are a chilling confirmation. Opened it in 49. They knew. He knew. Edmund knew. They knew what was behind that wall, and they chose to keep it sealed. The stone at the base of the fireplace is almost free. My hands are raw, my fingers aching, but I cannot stop. I cannot. The thought of what lies beyond, what I might find, fills me with a terror that is almost paralyzing. But the thought of not knowing, of living with this monstrous uncertainty, is far worse. If I am wrong, I lose my marriage, my home, my name. I will be branded a madwoman, a hysterical wife. If I am right, I lose my faith in everything I thought I knew about the man who shares my bed, the man I married. I lose my faith in the very foundations of this town. But the truth, however terrible, must be brought to light for Abigail, for Thomas, for all the silent ones. A glimmer of hope, faint but persistent, arrived in the form of a circuit preacher passing through Harwick Falls. He shared a strange anecdote with Reverend Holt. He had met a man in Providence in 1853, a mason who had been deeply troubled, haunted by a job he had taken years prior in western Massachusetts. The man claimed he had been hired to build a wall over a door, a task that had left him with a profound sense of unease. The man's name, Peter Goff. Reverend Holt, remembering the deed of purchase for the Vance fireplace, immediately recognized the name. Through his extensive network of church contacts, he managed to trace Peter Goff's current address. He presented it to Nell, a small slip of paper bearing a Providence address, a beacon of hope in the encroaching darkness. Nell, her hands trembling, composed a letter to Peter Goff. She poured her heart into it, carefully, subtly, without revealing the full extent of her suspicions, but hinting at a grave injustice, a secret buried beneath stone. She waited, each day an eternity, for a reply. One night, alone in the east parlor, the candle flame danced, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of old dust and that persistent metallic tang. Nell knelt before the fireplace, her chisel in hand, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The stone she had been working on was now almost entirely free. She could feel a distinct gap between it and the surrounding blocks. Her fingers, raw and aching, probed the opening. A cold draft, stronger than ever, snaked out, carrying with it that nameless smell, now almost overpowering. It was a smell that spoke of confinement, of dampness, of something long entombed. The candlelight glinted off the rough granite, highlighting the subtle imperfections, the deliberate cuts that had shaped these blocks into a facade. She imagined Goff, the mason, working here, his hands laying stone upon stone, sealing a secret. Did he know? Did he suspect? The thought was a chilling one. Her hands shook, not just from exertion, but from a profound sense of terror and anticipation. With a final, desperate heave, she managed to pry the stone loose. It fell with a soft thud onto the rug, revealing a dark, narrow aperture, a glimpse into the blackness beyond. The cold rushed out, a palpable presence, and with it the smell, now undeniable, unmistakable. It was the smell of a tomb. A human tomb. Nell stared into the darkness, her heart pounding, her breath caught in her throat. The truth she knew was just beyond this opening, waiting to be revealed. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Harwick Falls intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark history. Hit that like button, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. The year was 1859, and the long-awaited reply from Peter Goff finally arrived. It was a thick envelope bearing the postmark of Providence, Rhode Island, and Nell's hands trembled so violently as she broke the seal that Clara had to steady her. Inside, 4 closely written pages in a neat, precise hand unfolded a confession that chilled Nell to her very core. Providence, Rhode Island, August 14, 1859. Dear Madam, your letter, though vague in its specifics, has stirred a conscience that has known no peace for 11 long years. You speak of a grave injustice and a secret buried beneath stone in Harwick Falls, concerning a certain structure I erected in the autumn of 1848. I confess, Madam, that your words have found their mark, for the memory of that particular commission has been a torment to my soul, a shadow that has followed me since the day I left that town. I was indeed the mason hired by Mr. Edmund Vance in October of 1848. My instructions were precise, and at the time seemed merely unusual, not sinister. Mr. Vance desired a structural modification to the east wing of his residence. Specifically, he wished to convert a portion of the existing basement wine cellar into a smaller, more secure space, and to conceal its entrance. He provided detailed sketches, which I still possess, though they are now faded and brittle with age. The space was to be approximately 9 feet by 7 feet, carved from the cellar, with a new reinforced stone wall forming its interior boundary. The most peculiar instruction was regarding the entrance. Mr. Vance insisted that the existing cellar door, which opened into the east parlor, be bricked over entirely. Then a false fireplace structure, the very one you describe, was to be built directly in front of this newly sealed wall. This fireplace, though grand in appearance, was never intended for regular use, as its flue was deliberately narrowed and its hearth shallow. Its primary purpose, it became clear, was concealment. The room itself, he explained, was for secure storage of valuable documents. He specified a ventilation channel, a narrow shaft barely the width of a man's fist, to run from the top of the sealed room up through the chimney, to ensure air circulation for the preservation of papers. This detail too struck me as odd for mere documents, but Mr. Vance was a man of considerable influence, and I was a craftsman in need of work. The entrance to this secure storage was not to be the bricked-over door. Instead, a new heavy iron door was installed on the cellar side of the newly constructed interior wall. This door, madam, was designed to be sealed with 24 iron bolts driven from the outside. 3 heavy iron hinges secured it to the stone frame. I remember the weight of those bolts, the clang as they slid into place. I remember the final application of quick-setting mortar around the frame, sealing it completely. When I sealed the last bolt, when the mortar was dry, I stood there in the dim light of the cellar and listened. I heard nothing. I tell myself even now that I heard nothing. No sound, no cry, no whisper. But the silence that followed was not the silence of an empty room. It was a profound, unnatural silence, a silence that has echoed in my mind for 11 years. I left Harwick Falls shortly after, unable to shake the feeling that I had been an unwitting participant in something terrible. I have tried to forget, to bury the memory beneath the layers of new work, new towns. But your letter, madam, has brought it all rushing back. I have enclosed the original sketches Mr. Vance provided, along with my own detailed notes on the construction. I pray they offer some clarity and perhaps some justice. May God forgive me for my part in this. Yours, in troubled conscience, Peter Goff. ***. Nell read the letter aloud, her voice trembling, to Clara and Reverend Holt. The sketches, crude but precise, confirmed every horrifying detail. The 3 of them sat in stunned silence, the weight of Goff's confession pressing down on them. The secure storage for valuable documents was a lie. The ventilation channel, the iron door, the bolts driven from the outside, it was a prison. A tomb. We must act, Reverend Holt finally declared, his voice firm, his usual gentle demeanor replaced by a righteous anger. Tonight. On a night when Edmund was indeed away in Boston on mill business, Nell, Clara, and Reverend Holt gathered in the east parlor. The air was thick with tension, the silence punctuated only by their ragged breaths. Nell had already loosened 3 stones at the base of the fireplace over the previous months. The small aperture she had created was now a gaping maw in the granite. Clara held a single candle, its flame flickering wildly, casting dancing shadows that seemed to writhe with anticipation. Reverend Holt, his face grim, clutched a small leather-bound Bible, murmuring prayers under his breath. "Are you ready, Nell?" Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. Nell nodded, her jaw set. "As I'll ever be." They worked through the night, a desperate, silent ballet of excavation. The chisel, once Nell's embroidery tool, now became an instrument of truth. The sound of metal scraping against stone, the soft thud of falling mortar dust, the growing cold that emanated from the opening, every sensory detail was amplified, etched into Nell's memory. Clara's hands, usually so steady, shook uncontrollably, spilling hot wax onto the polished floor. Reverend Holt, his face pale, helped pry away the larger stones, his strength surprising for a man of his age. The metallic, coppery smell, now unmasked, grew stronger, sickeningly sweet and cloying, filling the room, clinging to their clothes, their hair, their very skin. It was the smell of confinement, of damp earth, and something else, something organic, long decayed. Finally, after hours of grueling labor, the false fireplace structure began to yield. Behind it, as Goff's letter had described, they found it, a heavy iron door set into a newly constructed stone wall. The bolts, thick and rusted, were indeed on the outside, driven deep into the stone frame. 24 of them, just as Goff had written. The sight was a punch to the gut, a horrifying confirmation of their darkest fears. "My God," Reverend Holt breathed, his voice barely a whisper. Nell, her hands raw and bleeding, reached for the bolts. They were stiff, rusted, but with a surge of adrenaline she began to turn them, one by agonizing one. The creak of metal, the groan of the old hinges echoed in the silent parlor, each sound a hammer blow to their collective conscience. Finally, with a last desperate pull, the iron door swung inward, revealing a black, cavernous space beyond. Clara raised the candle, its feeble light piercing the oppressive darkness. What they saw inside stole their breath, freezing them in place. It was a small room, barely 9 feet by 7, carved from the old wine cellar. The air was thick, stagnant, heavy with the smell of decay and damp earth. In one corner, a mattress rotted to nothing but a few tattered threads and springs lay on the cold, damp floor. Beside it, a tin cup, corroded and green with verdigris. A small leather-bound Bible, its pages eaten away by moisture and time, lay open, its words illegible. And on the stone wall, scratched with what must have been a nail or a hairpin, were hundreds of marks, tally marks counting the days. And below them, repeated over and over, a name etched with desperate, furious strokes, *Abigail Starr. And beneath her name, in careful, deliberate letters, a message that sent a fresh wave of horror through Nell, *she was alive in here. Someone knew. Someone brought food. The room was empty of a body. Abigail was not there. This realization, instead of bringing relief, brought a new, more terrifying question. If she had been alive, if someone had known, if someone had brought her food for years, then where was she? And who was this mysterious benefactor? The implications were staggering, a new layer of deception and complicity. Nell, her mind reeling, began to search the small, damp space by candlelight. Her eyes, accustomed to the gloom, scanned every inch of the stone walls, the earthen floor, and then, beneath a loose floor stone near the back wall, she found it, a folded piece of paper, brittle with age, but miraculously preserved from the worst of the damp. It was in Abigail's handwriting, unmistakable from the few letters Dorothea had shown her. It was a confession not of her own wrongdoing, but of what she had witnessed. October 17, 1848. I write this in the dark with a piece of charcoal I found, praying someone will one day find it. I must record what I know. I discovered Mr. Vance and Mr. Corbett in the study late at night. They were discussing ledgers, maps, and deeds. I saw them forging signatures, altering documents. They were stealing land, madam, from the mill workers, from the very families who toil for them. They were taking their small plots, their inheritance, through fraudulent means, replacing legitimate deeds with false ones. I saw it with my own eyes. I heard their plans. I confronted Mr. Vance. I told him I would not stand by and watch them rob these poor families. He smiled a cold, terrible smile and said he would handle the matter quietly. I thought he meant he would cease his activities. I was wrong. He meant he would silence me. He brought me down here to this cellar under the pretense of a task. He locked the door. He told me I would stay here until I learned to keep my mouth shut. I heard the masons working above, sealing the door. I heard the fireplace being built. I am trapped. I am cold. I am afraid. But I will not be silent. I will not let them win. May God help me. Abigail Pratt. Nell finished reading, her hands shaking so violently she almost dropped the paper. Fraud. Land theft. And Abigail, a young girl, had stumbled upon their monstrous scheme. Edmund had not just imprisoned her, he had silenced her to protect his ill-gotten gains. The depths of his depravity were unfathomable. But then another discovery. In a crack in the stone wall near where Abigail's name was scratched, Nell found a small iron key. It was crude, clearly handmade, but it was a key and it was made to fit the bolt lock on the iron door. Someone had possessed a key. Someone had been able to open the door from the outside. And scratched beside Abigail's name on the wall, in different handwriting, smaller, more careful, almost hidden, were 2 initials, *T. Thomas Aldrich. Thomas Aldrich, the mill worker who had disappeared in 1853. Thomas Aldrich, who had seen Edmund and Hiram carrying something heavy into the house in October 1848. Thomas Aldrich, who had known Abigail, was there. He had been feeding her. He had possessed a key. He had somehow gotten her out. And then he too had vanished. The implications cascaded, a dizzying torrent of possibilities. Abigail might be alive. Thomas might be alive. And Edmund knew that someone had gotten her out. He had known for years. He had simply allowed the town to believe she was gone and that Thomas had left, maintaining his facade of respectability while knowing the truth of their escape. Nell, Clara, and Reverend Holt, their faces grim, carefully sealed the room back as best they could, replacing the loose stones, obscuring the evidence of their intrusion. The secret, they knew, could not remain hidden for long. Reverend Holt, his resolve hardened by the night's discoveries, returned to his study. He wrote a letter that night, not to the local authorities, but directly to the circuit court in Springfield, Massachusetts. He enclosed Peter Goff's detailed confession, Abigail's own harrowing account, and a meticulous description of the physical evidence they had found in the hidden room. He detailed the fraudulent land transactions, the disappearance of Abigail and Thomas, and the complicity of Edmund Vance. 3 days later, Edmund returned from Boston. He walked into the east parlor, his eyes immediately drawn to the fireplace. He noticed the subtle shift in the mortar, the faint dust on the rug. He found Nell standing by the window, her back to him, her posture rigid. "Nell," he said, his voice calm, controlled. "It seems you have been busy in my absence." Nell turned, her eyes meeting his, devoid of fear, filled only with a cold, unwavering resolve. "I have been busy, Edmund. I have been busy uncovering the truth." Edmund's face remained impassive, but his eyes, Nell wrote in her journal that night, were the eyes of a man who has already calculated every outcome and found all of them acceptable, the eyes of a predator who knows he has been discovered but believes he is still beyond reach. The conversation that followed was chilling, a testament to Edmund's unshakable composure and Nell's newfound strength. "The truth, Nell?" Edmund scoffed, a faint, dismissive smile playing on his lips. "And what truth might that be? That you have been meddling in matters far beyond your understanding. That you have defiled my property." "The truth, Edmund," Nell replied, her voice steady, "of Abigail Pratt, of Thomas Aldrich, of the room behind that fireplace, of the fraudulent deeds. I know everything." Edmund took a step closer, his gaze piercing. "You know nothing, Nell. You have allowed your imagination to run wild. A girl left for Boston. A worker sought new opportunities. A fireplace is a fireplace. You will say nothing of this. You will forget what you think you have seen, for your own good. For the good of this family. For the good of Harwick Falls." "The good of Harwick Falls," Nell retorted, a bitter laugh escaping her lips, "or the good of Edmund Vance. Your secrets are no longer safe, Edmund. The truth has a way of finding its light, no matter how deeply it is buried." Edmund simply stared at her, his expression unreadable. "You will regret this, Nell," he said, his voice a low, dangerous whisper. "You will regret this more than anything you have ever done." Nell met his gaze, unflinching. "Perhaps. But I will not live with your lies any longer." The battle lines were drawn. The silence of Harwick Falls was about to be shattered. The circuit court in Springfield, Massachusetts, received Reverend Holt's meticulously documented letter, and the quiet, ordered world of Harwick Falls began to unravel. The initial response was one of disbelief, then cautious inquiry. Judge Elias Finn, upon learning of the investigation, immediately attempted to suppress the inquiry, leveraging his long-standing connections within the legal establishment. He argued that the accusations were baseless, the ramblings of a hysterical woman and an overzealous minister. However, Reverend Holt, with a foresight born of deep suspicion, had sent his letter directly to the state level, bypassing the local circuit entirely. His careful planning ensured that the investigation, once initiated, could not be easily dismissed or buried. The state authorities, recognizing the gravity of the allegations and the detailed evidence provided, overruled Judge Finn, and a full investigation was launched. The first casualty of the unfolding scandal was Deputy Wallace Orne. In the spring of 1861, he resigned from his post without explanation, his departure swift and silent. The town whispered, but no one dared to speak openly of the true reasons behind his sudden exit. His loyalty to Edmund Vance, once a mark of his character, now seemed a stain. Edmund Vance was formally charged with unlawful imprisonment, fraud, and obstruction of justice. He was brought before the court in Springfield in September 1861. The trial, a sensational affair that drew spectators from across the state, lasted 3 weeks. The courtroom, usually a somber place of legal procedure, became a theater of human drama. Nell Vance, composed and resolute, was the first key witness for the prosecution. She recounted her years of growing suspicion, her meticulous investigation, the discovery of the scratches, the returned letters, the ironmonger's receipt, and finally the harrowing night they opened the hidden room. Her testimony was delivered with a quiet dignity that lent immense credibility to her astonishing claims. Mrs. Vance, the prosecutor, a sharp-witted young man named Mr. Davies, asked, "Can you describe for the court the condition of the room you discovered behind the fireplace?" Nell's voice, though soft, carried clearly through the hushed courtroom. It was small, barely 9 feet by 7, damp. The air was thick with the smell of decay. There was a rotted mattress, a corroded tin cup, and a Bible, its pages ruined by moisture. And on the wall, etched into the stone, was the name Abigail *, repeated many times, and below it the words, "She was alive in here." Someone knew. Someone brought food. Next, Peter Goff, the mason, took the stand. His testimony, delivered with a palpable sense of guilt and relief, corroborated Nell's account and provided the technical details of the room's construction. He presented his original sketches, now official exhibits, which clearly showed the iron door and the external bolts. Mr. Goff, Edmund's attorney, a formidable orator named Mr. Blackwood, challenged, "You claim Mr. Vance commissioned you to build a prison. Yet you accepted payment, completed the work, and remained silent for over a decade. Why did you not come forward sooner if you truly believed a crime was being committed?" Goff's voice was thick with emotion. "I was a young man, sir, in need of work. Mr. Vance was a powerful man. I told myself it was for secure storage. I tried to believe it, but the silence after I sealed that door, it haunted me. I left Harwick Falls because I could not bear to stay. It was not until Mrs. Vance's letter and the knowledge that others were seeking the truth that I found the courage to speak." Edmund Vance throughout these testimonies remained impassive, his face a mask of controlled indifference. His defense was simple and unwavering. Abigail Pratt had left Harwick Falls willingly, a flighty girl seeking adventure. The room was a storage space, a secure vault for valuable documents, as he had told Goff. The letters, the scratches, the confession found in the room all were fabrications, part of a malicious plot by his estranged wife and her co-conspirators to ruin his reputation and seize his assets. He spoke calmly, eloquently, his voice resonating with authority. His attorney, Mr. Blackwood, was brilliant, weaving a narrative of marital discord and vengeful accusations. The town of Harwick Falls was deeply divided, some clinging to the image of their respected mill owner, others swayed by the chilling evidence presented. Then, 6 days before the verdict was to be delivered, a letter arrived at the Springfield courthouse. It bore the postmark of Portland, Maine. It was addressed to the presiding judge, and its content sent a ripple of shock through the entire legal community. The letter was from a woman named Abigail Aldrich, formerly Abigail Pratt. Portland, Maine, September 28, 1861. To the esteemed judge of the Circuit Court, Springfield, Massachusetts. It has come to my attention through a notice in the Portland Gazette regarding the trial of Edmund Vance that the truth of my disappearance from Harwick Falls is finally being sought. For 12 years, I have lived in silence under a new name, fearing that no one would ever believe my story. But now, it seems the walls have finally begun to speak. My name is Abigail Aldrich, and I am the Abigail Pratt who vanished from Harwick Falls in October of 1848. I was indeed imprisoned by Edmund Vance in a hidden room behind the fireplace in his home. I discovered his fraudulent scheme to steal land from the mill workers, and when I confronted him, he sealed me away. I counted the days, scratching them into the stone. I wrote my confession, hoping it would one day be found. I was alive in that room for nearly 5 years. I survived because of the kindness and bravery of Thomas Aldrich, a mill worker who discovered my plight. He brought me food and water through the narrow ventilation shaft, risking his own life daily. He found a way to fashion a key, a crude but effective tool, to open the bolts from the outside. In the spring of 1853, during one of Mr. Vance's absences, Thomas managed to remove the outer bolts and free me, and we fled Harwick Falls under the cover of darkness, hidden in the back of a supply wagon bound for Providence. From there, we made our way to Portland, where we married and began new lives, always looking over our shoulders, always fearing discovery. I have been silent for so long because I knew the power of Edmund Vance, and I feared that my word, a simple mill girl's word, would never stand against his. I waited, praying that someone would open that room and find my words on the wall, my confession beneath the loose stone. It seems my prayers have been answered. I am prepared to travel to Springfield and testify to the truth of these events. May justice finally be served. Sincerely, Abigail Aldrich, née Pratt. The courtroom erupted when the news spread. Abigail Aldrich, formerly Abigail Pratt, was alive. She was 30 years old. She arrived in Springfield 2 days later, a woman transformed by hardship and resilience, but unmistakably the same Abigail Pratt who had vanished 12 years prior. Her testimony was the final devastating blow to Edmund Vance's defense. She walked into the courtroom, her gaze steady, her posture erect. A hush fell over the room so profound that the scratching of a clerk's pen sounded like thunder. Every eye was on her. And then Edmund Vance, for the first time in the entire trial, broke his composure. His eyes, usually so cold and calculating, widened in a flicker of pure, unadulterated shock and terror as he saw her. The mask finally slipped. "Miss Aldrich," Mr. Davies began gently, "can you tell the court in your own words what happened to you in October of 1848? Abigail's voice, though soft, was clear and unwavering. She recounted her discovery of the fraudulent deeds, her confrontation with Edmund Vance, the moment he led her into the cellar, the clang of the iron door, the sound of the masons working above, sealing her fate. She described the darkness, the cold, the despair, the counting of the days, the hope that flickered with each delivery of food from Thomas. She described their daring escape, their flight to Portland, and the years of living in fear. Her testimony was not just a recounting of facts, it was a testament to human endurance, a raw, emotional narrative that captivated the courtroom. And Mr. Vance, Mr. Blackwood, Edmund's attorney, stammered, attempting a cross-examination, "You claim he imprisoned you. Yet you are here today, alive and well. How do you explain this discrepancy?" Abigail met his gaze, her eyes filled with a quiet strength. "I am here today, sir, because of the courage of another man, Thomas Aldrich, who risked everything to save me. Not because Mr. Vance had a change of heart. He left me to die." The jury, after only 2 hours of deliberation, returned a verdict. Edmund Vance was found guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to 14 years in the Massachusetts State Prison at Charlestown, a sentence that effectively ended his life as a free man. Judge Elias Finn, his reputation irrevocably tarnished by his attempts to suppress the investigation and his clear complicity, was removed from the bench. His name, once synonymous with justice in the region, was quietly expunged from the town records, a silent condemnation. Thomas Aldrich, the unsung hero, returned to Harwick Falls briefly, just once. Reverend Holt, in a public ceremony at the church, thanked him for his extraordinary bravery, acknowledging his role in bringing the truth to light. Thomas, a man of few words, simply nodded, his gaze finding knells across the crowded church. He and Abigail, now free from the shadow of Edmund Vance, returned to Portland, to the life they had built together. Hiram Corbett's estate, after a lengthy legal process, was liquidated. The proceeds, a substantial sum, were distributed to the mill workers whose land had been fraudulently seized by Vance and Corbett, a small measure of justice for years of exploitation. The Vance house, once a symbol of power and prosperity, became a monument to a dark secret. It was sold, its grandeur now tainted by its horrifying history. The new owners, a family from Boston, sealed the east parlor permanently, never using the room, its secrets now a permanent part of its silent walls. Nell Vance, her mission accomplished, kept her journal. She published it quietly under the pseudonym A Woman of Harwick Falls in 1863, a small printing distributed through church networks across Massachusetts. The book was titled *The East Wall Star*. It was a stark, unflinching account of her journey, a testament to the power of truth and the insidious nature of complicity. The final scene finds Nell standing at the window of a modest boarding house in Northampton, Massachusetts, in the autumn of 1863. She had left Harwick Falls, leaving behind the grand mansion, the whispers, the ghosts. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and distant woods. She opened the window, letting the cool, clean air wash over her face. For the first time in 16 years, she felt air that did not carry the cold of that east wall, that metallic tang of old blood, that suffocating weight of unspoken secrets. She was free. The hidden room behind the fireplace had indeed changed the town's history. It had revealed not just a single crime, but the intricate architecture of complicity. How many people must look away, must stay silent, must choose their own comfort and self-preservation over someone else's life, for one man's monstrous secret to survive for years. It was a chilling reminder that the most terrifying walls are not always made of stone, but of the silence that allows injustice to flourish. This mystery shows us that the most terrifying walls are not the ones made of stone, they are the ones made of silence. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was truly revealed? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who loves dark history. See you in the next.